The lawyer read the last line of the will and looked at me like she was delivering a diagnosis. And to my grandson, I leave my 1979 Ford F-150 pickup truck, along with everything it carries, and the attached note. She handed me a folded piece of paper. I opened it. In my grandfather's handwriting, 7 words. She has one last trip in her, son. My brother leaned forward in his chair and grinned. My father shook his head and whispered to my mother, loud enough for everyone in the room to hear. He left him a pile of rust. Call a scrapyard. My sister did not even look up from her phone. The truck had been sitting in my grandfather's driveway for 18 years. It had not started since 2006. The tires were flat. The paint had faded from cherry red to a dull, sunburned pink, and a family of squirrels had taken up residence under the hood. It was, by any reasonable measure, worthless. I folded the note, put it in my shirt pocket, and signed the papers without saying a word. 6 weeks later, I was underneath that truck in my garage on a Saturday night, cutting through a steel compartment that had been welded to the frame, hidden beneath the truck bed where nobody would ever think to look. And inside that compartment was a waterproof case containing the evidence that my grandfather, the man my family dismissed as a simple truck driver, had spent 42 years buying land across 7 states and had built a portfolio worth $31 million. Every acre purchased in cash. Every deed filed through trusts nobody knew existed. Every mile of highway he ever drove hiding a secret that would tear my family apart. I should have seen it coming. 37 years of signs. And I missed every one. My name is Daniel Mercer. At 37, I was a civil engineer specializing in highway infrastructure for one of the largest transportation firms in Illinois. I designed roads, overpasses, bridge abutments, interchange systems that moved 100,000 cars a day without anyone ever thinking about the man who planned the curve radius or calculated the drainage gradient. I understood how things connect, how point A reaches point B, how the invisible work beneath the surface is the only reason the visible surface holds together. The metaphor writes itself, but I did not see it until I was lying on my back under a dead truck with a cutting torch in my hand. I grew up in Joliet, Illinois, a blue-collar town 40 miles southwest of Chicago, the kind of place where people worked with their hands and measured success by whether the mortgage got paid on time. My father, Gerald Mercer, managed a regional trucking dispatch office. He wore short-sleeve dress shirts and clip-on ties and talked about logistics the way other men talked about football, with authority and volume but very little depth. He had married my mother, Linda, when they were both 23, and they had produced 3 children in 5 years. My older brother, Craig, came first, then me 18 months later, then my younger sister, Amber, 3 years after that. The hierarchy was established before I could walk. Craig was the firstborn, the heir, the one who carried my father's name and my father's ambitions. He played football in high school, not well enough for a scholarship but well enough for my father to spend every Friday night in the bleachers screaming his name. Craig went to community college, dropped out after a year, and went into commercial real estate with a loan my father co-signed. He drove a leased BMW, wore watches he could not afford, and talked about deals with the breathless confidence of a man who had never once been told he was wrong. My parents treated Craig's mediocrity like genius. Every minor accomplishment was celebrated. Every failure was reframed as a learning experience. Every dollar he lost was an investment in his future. Amber was the baby, the girl my mother had always wanted after 2 boys. She was delicate and dramatic and had learned by age 6 that tears were a currency accepted everywhere in our household. She studied communications at a state university that cost $40,000 a year, funded entirely by my parents, and then moved back home to figure out what she wanted to do with her life. She was still figuring it out at 29, living in a condo my father had put a down payment on, working part-time at a marketing firm and spending full-time on Instagram. And then there was me, Daniel, Dan, the middle child, the quiet one, the one who got straight A's that nobody mentioned, who built model bridges in the basement that nobody admired, who won a full academic scholarship to the University of Illinois because my parents told me they had already allocated their resources to Craig's business and Amber's education. "You are the smart one, Danny," my mother said, as if intelligence were a consolation prize rather than an achievement. "You will figure it out." I figured it out. I worked 2 jobs through college. I graduated summa cum laude with a degree in civil engineering. I got a job at a top firm before my senior year ended. I paid off every loan within 7 years. I earned my professional engineer license at 28, the youngest in my firm's history. I was promoted to senior project engineer by 31. I earned $142,000 a year, lived in a clean apartment in the West Loop, and owned my car outright. I was, by any objective measure, the most successful person in my family. Nobody noticed. The invisibility was not dramatic. It was architectural. Built into the structure of my family the way rebar is built into concrete. You cannot see it, but it determines what the structure can bear. When I was 12, I placed second in the State Science Olympiad. Engineering Division. I came home with a silver medal and a certificate signed by the governor. My mother put the certificate on the refrigerator. It stayed there for 3 days before she replaced it with a flyer for Craig's football fundraiser. I did not say anything. I just noticed. When I was 15, I designed and built a functioning suspension bridge model out of balsa wood and fishing line for a regional engineering competition. It held 97 pounds before failure, the second highest in the competition's history. My father was supposed to drive me to the awards banquet. He forgot. He was at Craig's lacrosse banquet, which was the same night. My mother called at 7:30 and said, "Danny, I am so sorry. Your father mixed up the dates. Can you get a ride with someone?" I called Grandpa Walt. He drove 40 minutes in the rain and sat next to me at a table full of strangers, wearing his flannel shirt among parents in sport coats, and he clapped when they called my name. On the way home, he said, "Danny, someday they are going to realize what they missed, and by then you will be too far ahead for it to matter." I graduated high school as valedictorian. My parents attended the ceremony. My father spent most of it talking to Craig's old football coach, who was sitting 2 rows ahead. When I delivered my speech about infrastructure and the invisible systems that hold society together, my mother whispered to my father, "He is so serious for 18. Grandpa Walt was in the 5th row, directly in my line of sight. He did not whisper anything. He just listened. The only person who ever noticed was my grandfather. Grandpa Walt, Walter James Mercer. He was my father's father, though the two of them shared little beyond a last name and a grudging tolerance of each other's presence at holidays. Grandpa Walt had been a long-haul truck driver for 42 years. He drove for a company called Heartland Freight, running routes from Chicago to Denver, Chicago to Dallas, Chicago to Memphis, Chicago to Omaha. 5 days a week, 50 weeks a year, for over 4 decades. He knew every mile of Interstate 55, 80, 88, and 90 the way a surgeon knows anatomy. He could tell you where the pavement changed in central Iowa, where the wind shear hit hardest outside of Cheyenne, where the best truck stops were in every state between Illinois and Colorado. My father was embarrassed by him. Not openly. Gerald Mercer was too careful for that. But in the way he introduced Grandpa Walt to his friends, the way he minimized his profession, the way he said, "Dad drove trucks," in a tone that made it sound like a diagnosis rather than a career. 42 years on the road, millions of miles, never a serious accident, never a late delivery, and my father reduced it to a sentence spoken with a shrug. But Grandpa Walt was not what my father thought he was. He was not what anyone thought he was. He was quiet and observant and patient in a way that made most people underestimate him. He wore flannel shirts and steel-toed boots and drove that old red Ford everywhere. Even after he retired, even after the engine started misfiring and the exhaust rattled like a tin can full of nails. He lived in a small ranch house in Plainfield that he had paid off in 1989, and he kept a garden in the backyard where he grew tomatoes and peppers and sunflowers that were taller than I was. When I was 9 years old, Grandpa Walt started taking me on rides in the truck. Not long-haul trips. Saturday afternoon drives through the countryside south of Joliet, past cornfields and grain elevators and small towns with names like Manhattan and Elwood and Simerton. He would drive slowly, one hand on the wheel, and point out things nobody else would notice. A farmhouse with a new roof. A lot with a for sale sign half hidden by overgrown weeds. A stretch of road where the county had just paved a new interchange. "See that, Danny?" he would say. That interchange means this area is growing. When the roads come, the people follow. And when the people follow, the land gets valuable. I did not understand what he meant at the time. I was 9. I just liked riding in the truck with my grandfather, feeling the vibration of the engine through the bench seat, listening to him talk about roads and distances and the way the country looked from behind the wheel. As I got older, those rides became my sanctuary. Every other Saturday, while Craig was at whatever sporting event my father was attending and Amber was at dance class with my mother, I was in Grandpa Walt's truck, driving back roads, eating gas station sandwiches, and talking about everything. He asked me about school. He asked me about engineering. He asked me what I was building, what I was reading, what I was thinking about. He listened to my answers the way nobody else in my family ever did. With attention, with interest, with the unmistakable look of a man who recognized something in me that mattered to him. When I was 16, he took me on a longer drive. 3 hours south, down Interstate 55, past Bloomington and Springfield, to a stretch of flat farmland outside of a town called Litchfield. He pulled off the highway onto a county road and stopped the truck beside a cornfield. We got out and stood there in the wind, looking at nothing. Just land. Flat, empty, ordinary land. "I bought this," he said. I looked at him. "Bought what?" "This. 40 acres. Bought it in 1983 for $6,000. "Why?" He pointed at the highway visible in the distance. "See where they are building that new ramp? That was not there when I bought this field. But I knew it was coming. I drove this route 3 times a week for 30 years. I watched the traffic increase. I watched the towns grow. I watched the county put in new roads. And I knew that one day, this field would be worth more than $6,000. He paused. "It is worth about $400,000 now." I stared at him. "Grandpa, that is a huge return." He smiled, that quiet, knowing smile he had. "Danny, I have 40 acres in 6 states. Nobody knows. Not your father. Not your grandmother before she passed. Nobody. And I am telling you because someday you are going to understand why." I wanted to ask more, but he shook his head and said, "Not yet. When the time is right." He got back in the truck, and we drove home in silence. I thought about that conversation for years. I never brought it up again because he had asked me not to, and I respected Grandpa Walt more than anyone in the world. The family dynamics continued to sharpen as I entered my career. I became the invisible banker. When Craig's first real estate deal went sideways and he needed $52,000 to settle with investors, my parents called me. Not Craig. Not a bank. Me. I was 28 years old and had saved $60,000 through years of discipline and sacrifice. I wired Craig $52,000 because my mother was crying on the phone and my father said, "This is what family does, Daniel." Craig never mentioned it again. No payment plan. No acknowledgement. No thank you. When Amber needed a co-signer on her condo lease because her credit score was too low, I signed. When my parents' water heater exploded and flooded the basement, I paid for the remediation and the replacement, $14,000. When Craig's second deal required an emergency bridge loan, my father asked me for $35,000. I hesitated. My father said, "Daniel, your brother has a family to support. You are single. You can afford it." I could afford it. That was true. But the reason I could afford it was that I had been disciplined and responsible while Craig had been reckless and entitled. I sent the money anyway. Over 14 years, I gave my family approximately $237,000. I kept records. Every wire transfer, every check, every co-signed document. Not because I expected repayment, because I needed proof that I was part of this family, that I contributed, that I existed in their lives for a reason beyond my bank account. The only acknowledgement I ever received was at Thanksgiving 2022. My mother raised her glass and said, "I am grateful that we are all together and that we can count on each other." She looked at Craig when she said it. She looked at Amber when she said it. She did not look at me. I was sitting at the end of the table, in a chair that had been pulled from the home office because there were not enough dining chairs. Nobody had mentioned that there were not enough chairs until I arrived. It was not an isolated incident. It was a pattern so consistent it had become invisible, like background noise you stop hearing because it has always been there. At Craig's 40th birthday party, my parents rented a banquet room at a restaurant in Naperville. There were 40 guests. They forgot to add my name to the reservation list, and when I arrived, the hostess said, "I am sorry, I do not see a Daniel Mercer on the guest list." I had to text Craig to come to the front and vouch for me. He looked annoyed, like I was creating a problem by existing. At Amber's engagement party, which lasted for 3 hours, my father gave a toast that mentioned every member of the family by name except me. He talked about Craig's leadership. He talked about my mother's grace. He talked about Amber's spirit. He raised his glass to the Mercer family. I was standing 6 feet away, holding a glass of champagne that nobody had poured for me, and my name did not leave his lips. I drove home that night and sat in my car in the parking garage for 20 minutes, staring at the steering wheel, trying to understand how a man can have 3 children and only see 2 of them. Grandpa Walt called me that Christmas Eve the way he always did. His voice was slower than I remembered. Thinner. He was 84 years old, and the years behind the wheel had taken their toll on his back and his hips and his hands. But his mind was as sharp as the day he showed me the 40 acres in Litchfield. "How was dinner, Danny?" "Fine." He knew I was lying. He always knew. "Danny, listen. I am working on something. Something important. When I am gone, they are going to give you the scraps. They always have. But I need you to remember what I told you when you were 16. About the land. About the roads." "I remember." "Good. When the time comes, do not listen to what they tell you something is worth. Look underneath. The value is always underneath." He died on February 19th, 2024. A stroke at his kitchen table. The paramedics found him sitting upright with a cup of coffee in front of him and the morning newspaper open to the real estate section. He was 85 years old. The funeral was small and efficient, like everything about Grandpa Walt. A service at the Lutheran Church in Plainfield, a burial in the Veterans Cemetery, because he had served 2 years in the Army before becoming a truck driver. My father gave a eulogy that lasted 90 seconds and mentioned Grandpa Walt's years on the road, as if driving 42 years of long-haul freight was roughly equivalent to a long commute. Craig wore sunglasses inside the church and checked his phone during the prayers. Amber cried because she always cried at events, not because she had any particular connection to the man in the casket. She had not visited Grandpa Walt in over 3 years. I gave the second eulogy. I talked about Saturday drives and gas station sandwiches and a man who could read a landscape the way most people read a newspaper. I talked about patience and observation and the quiet intelligence of someone who spent 4 decades watching the country from behind a windshield and understanding it better than any economist or developer ever could. I looked at my family while I spoke. Nobody was listening. My father was staring at his hands. Craig was looking toward the exit. My mother was whispering something to Amber about the reception afterward. The only person in that church who seemed to hear me was a man I did not recognize, sitting in the last row. He was about 70, heavy-set, wearing a good suit that did not quite fit him. He nodded at me when I finished. I nodded back. After the service, he found me in the parking lot. He extended his hand. "Russell Tate. I was your grandfather's attorney for 31 years. He paused. "He talked about you constantly." "He never mentioned you," I said. Not rudely, just honestly. Russell smiled. "That was the point. Your grandfather was a very private man, Mr. Mercer. Strategically private. When the will is read, please pay close attention to the wording. And please, whatever they say about the truck, do not listen to them." The will reading was the following week. The estate was divided as expected. The ranch house in Plainfield, now appraised at $1.9 million thanks to the area's development, went to Craig. My father argued that as the direct son he should receive the house, but Grandpa Walt's will was explicit. The property went to the eldest grandchild. The investment accounts, totaling $280,000, went to Amber. The life insurance payout and personal effects went to my mother, because Grandpa Walt had always been fond of her despite everything. My father received a single item, a framed photograph of himself at age 10, sitting in the cab of Grandpa Walt's first truck. It was a pointed gift. A reminder of who my father used to be before he became the man who was embarrassed by his own father. And I received the truck. The 1979 Ford F-150 that had been slowly decaying in Grandpa Walt's driveway since the engine finally quit in 2006. Along with the note, "She has one last trip in her, son." Russell Tate watched me from across the conference table with the same expression Grandpa Walt used to have. Patient, knowing, like he was watching the first domino tip and already knew where the last one would land. I had the truck towed to my apartment building's parking garage. The tow truck driver looked at it and said, "Buddy, you know this thing is scrap, right? I can drop it at the yard instead. Save you the trouble." I said no. He shrugged and unloaded it in the corner spot I had reserved. It sat there, low and heavy on 4 flat tires, leaking a constellation of oil stains onto the concrete. My neighbor in the building, a management consultant named Kevin who drove a Tesla, walked past it every morning and looked at it the way you look at something that might be contagious. For 3 weeks, I did nothing with it. I drove to work, came home, parked next to it, and thought about Grandpa Walt, about the note, about Russell Tate's warning, about the 40 acres in Litchfield and the conversation I had when I was 16. The value is always underneath. On a Friday evening in mid-March, I changed into work clothes, inflated the tires enough to roll the truck forward, and started inspecting it. Not to restore it. Not yet. To understand it. The way Grandpa Walt had taught me to understand things. By looking carefully. By listening. By not assuming I already knew what I was dealing with. The cab was surprisingly clean. No trash, no clutter. The bench seat was cracked but intact. The dashboard was dusty but functional. In the glove compartment, I found a pair of leatherwork gloves, a road atlas from 1997 with certain pages dog-eared, and an old fuel log where Grandpa Walt had recorded every fill-up for what looked like decades. I flipped through the atlas. The dog-eared pages were all rural areas. Farmland in central Illinois, prairie outside of Omaha, hill country south of Dallas, forest land in the Ozarks, ranchland in eastern Colorado. Each dog-eared page had small pencil marks on it. Dots. Locations. Some had notes beside them in Grandpa Walt's handwriting. Interstate Expansion 2004. New Distribution Center approved. Mineral Survey pending. County road paved. Access improved. He had been mapping his acquisitions the way a general maps a campaign. Every dot was a position. Every note was intelligence. And the atlas had been sitting in the glove compartment of a dead truck for 18 years, waiting. I counted the dots. 22 across 7 states. My heart rate started climbing. I closed the atlas carefully and set it on the workbench. My hands were trembling, not from cold, from the growing suspicion that this truck was not a consolation prize. It was a map. I set the atlas on the workbench and went back to the truck. I checked under the seats. Nothing. I checked behind the seat. Nothing. I popped the hood and looked at the engine. It was a straight 6, reliable and simple, caked with years of grime but structurally sound. Nothing unusual. I crawled underneath and looked at the frame. Standard for a 79 F-150. Ladder frame, 2 rails running the length of the truck. I moved my flashlight along the rails, checking for rust, for damage. And then I saw it. Underneath the truck bed, between the 2 frame rails, there was a steel box. It was not part of the original truck. It had been welded directly to the frame rails, fitted precisely into the space between them, and painted the same flat black as the undercarriage. Unless you removed the truck bed or crawled underneath with a light and knew what you were looking for, you would never see it. It was invisible. Deliberately, expertly invisible. The welds were clean and professional. Grandpa Walt had been welding since he was 20 years old. He could join steel the way a surgeon joins tissue, precise, strong, permanent. The box was approximately 30 inches long, 18 inches wide, and 6 inches deep. There was no hinge, no latch, no opening mechanism visible. It was sealed shut. I spent the next 2 hours removing the truck bed. 8 bolts, all rusted, all requiring penetrating oil and a breaker bar and language that would have made Grandpa Walt shake his head. When the bed finally lifted free and I set it against the garage wall, The steel box sat exposed on the frame like a secret that had been waiting decades to be told. I used a cutting wheel to open it. The steel was thick, nearly a quarter-inch, and it took 20 minutes of careful work to cut along one side without damaging whatever was inside. Sparks cascaded off the frame and died on the concrete floor. The sound of the cutting will echoed through the empty garage, high and sharp, like a scream being held back. When I finally peeled back the cut section, the edges still warm, I found a waterproof case, the kind used for storing firearms or sensitive equipment. Black plastic, sealed with rubber gaskets, latched on 4 sides. It was heavy, maybe 15 pounds. The gaskets were still tight. Whatever was inside had been protected from moisture, from heat, from the 18 years of Illinois winters that had tried to eat this truck alive. I carried it to my workbench. My hands were shaking. Grease and sweat on my fingers made the latches difficult to grip. I wiped my hands on my jeans and tried again. The first latch popped. Then the second. Then the third and fourth. I lifted the lid. The smell hit me first. Old paper. Leather. The faint chemical scent of preserved documents. The interior was lined with foam, each item nestled in its own cutout, arranged with the precision of a man who had spent decades organizing toolboxes and truck cabs and workshops. Inside were 6 items, each one sealed in its own labeled plastic bag. A brass key on a steel ring. A sealed envelope with my name on it. A leather journal, thick and worn, with decades of entries. A large manila folder containing what appeared to be legal documents. A USB drive in a protective case. And a separate sealed envelope marked, "For Daniel only," regarding Gerald and Craig Mercer. I sat on my workbench stool and opened the letter first. The letter was 11 pages long, written in blue ballpoint, in Grandpa Walt's square, unhurried handwriting. It began, "Dear Danny, if you are reading this, then you found the box. I knew you would. You are the only one who would ever look underneath." He told me everything, the real story of his life. Not the version my father told. The simple truck driver who lived in a small house and drove an old pickup. The version that nobody knew. It started in 1976. Grandpa Walt was 37 years old and driving his usual route from Chicago to Denver. Somewhere outside of Lincoln, Nebraska, he stopped at a gas station and noticed a handwritten sign on the bulletin board, 40 acres, $4,000, owner financing. He wrote down the number. He called from a payphone that night. The land was flat, empty, 20 miles from the nearest town, and the owner was an elderly farmer who wanted to retire to Arizona. Walt drove out to see it the next week on a day off. He walked the property. He looked at the highway in the distance. He thought about the traffic patterns he had observed over 10 years of driving this route. He bought it for $3,800 in cash. That was the beginning. Over the next 42 years, every time Walt drove his routes, he watched the land. He watched which areas were growing. He watched where new highways were being planned, where interchanges were being built, where the government was investing in infrastructure. He read the real estate sections of local newspapers in every city he stopped in. He talked to gas station owners, diner waitresses, county clerks. He gathered intelligence the old-fashioned way, mile by mile, conversation by conversation, year by year. And every time he found a piece of land that met his criteria, cheap, overlooked, position near future growth, he bought it. Always in cash. Always through a trust or an LLC that Russell Tate set up for him. Always quietly. He never told anyone. Not his wife, my grandmother, who died in 2009 without knowing. Not my father. Not a single person except Russell Tate and an accountant named Phyllis Kwan who handled the tax filings. The journal documented everything. 22 properties across 7 states. Illinois, Nebraska, Iowa, Missouri, Oklahoma, Texas, and Colorado. Some were small, 10 or 20 acres. Some were large, 160 acres of ranchland in eastern Colorado that he had bought for $12,000 in 1984. The journal listed each property with the date of purchase, the price paid, the trust name, and periodic assessments of value that Walt had conducted himself, driving out to each property on his routes and noting changes in the surrounding area. The manila folder contained the legal documents, 22 deeds. 22 trust agreements, tax records going back decades, and a master document that Russell Tate had prepared, summarizing the entire portfolio. Total assessed value as of December 2023, $31.4 million. I read the number and then I read it again. I put the letter down on the workbench and stared at the garage wall for a long time. $31 million. My grandfather, the truck driver who wore flannel shirts and grew tomatoes in his backyard, who lived in a house he paid off in 1989, who drove a truck that had not started in 18 years, had built a $31 million land portfolio by watching highways from behind a windshield for 4 decades. But it was not just the land. Several of the properties had become significantly more valuable for reasons beyond location. 3 parcels in Oklahoma and 2 in Colorado sat on top of natural gas deposits. Grandpa Walt had retained the mineral rights when he purchased the land, a detail that most buyers overlook but that Grandpa Walt, with his quiet intelligence and his long-haul patience, had understood instinctively. Energy companies had been leasing those mineral rights for over 15 years. The royalty payments alone totaled over $900,000 annually. The letter explained why he had hidden everything. The same story, the same lesson, the same family. In 2003, Grandpa Walt had received a modest inheritance from a cousin who died without children. $41,000. He mentioned it to my father at a family barbecue. Within 2 weeks, Craig had called asking for $20,000 to cover a shortfall on a property deal. My father had suggested Walt invest in Craig's business. Amber had asked if Grandpa could help with her college application fees. The $41,000 was gone within 3 months. Redistributed. Consumed. Absorbed into the family machine that turned one person's assets into everyone else's expenses. Walt never made that mistake again. He tightened his security. He told Russell Tate to add additional layers of protection to the trusts. He simplified his visible life even further. He let the truck die in the driveway. He wore older clothes. He declined invitations to restaurants, saying he preferred to eat at home. He became the image my father wanted to see. A retired truck driver living a small, simple life on a small, simple pension. And behind that image, invisible and growing, was an empire built 1 acre at a time along the highways of America. The second envelope was harder to open. Not physically, emotionally, because I already suspected what was inside. In 2021, my father and Craig had contacted an elder law attorney about obtaining conservatorship over Grandpa Walt. The documents in the envelope laid it out in detail. They had claimed that Walt was showing signs of cognitive decline, that he was making poor financial decisions, that he needed a guardian to manage his affairs. The petition included statements from my father describing erratic behavior and confusion about basic financial matters. Craig had signed a supporting affidavit claiming that Grandpa Walt had given away money to strangers and was unable to manage his household. None of it was true. Grandpa Walt was 82 years old in 2021 and as sharp as he had ever been. He did the New York Times crossword every morning. He managed a 22-property portfolio across 7 states. He read 3 newspapers a day and could quote interest rates and commodity prices from memory. The conservatorship petition was not about protecting a declining old man. It was about gaining access to whatever assets they suspected he had. Grandpa Walt had found out because Russell Tate's office received a copy of the petition through a court filing. Russell called Walt immediately. Walt was not surprised. He told Russell he had been expecting something like this for years. He said, "They do not want to take care of me, Russell. They want to take what is mine. The way they have always taken what is Danny's." That was the moment Walt finalized the trusts. He added a conservatorship defense clause. He updated his medical records with a full cognitive assessment administered by a neuropsychologist, scoring in the 96th percentile for his age group. He wrote a sworn statement describing the petition as fraudulent and included the forensic evidence proving his full mental capacity. He filed a countermotion that effectively killed the conservatorship attempt before it reached a hearing. And he added every document to the waterproof case in the steel box welded to the frame of his truck. The petition was quietly withdrawn. My father and Craig never mentioned it. They pretended it had never happened. and Grandpa Walt sat in his kitchen and drank his coffee and watched them pretend. The way he had watched the highways for 42 years, patient and silent and seeing everything. His letter ended with instructions. The brass key opened a safe deposit box at a bank in Joliet. The USB drive contained digital copies of every document, every deed, every trust agreement, every tax return. Russell Tate had complete files and was expecting my call. A property management transition plan was already in place. The trusts transferred automatically to me upon Walt's death, bypassing probate entirely. The last page of the letter said, "Danny, I drove 3 million miles in my life. Every mile I was looking for two things: good land and a good man to leave it to. The land was everywhere. The man took longer to find. But I found him. Every Saturday, in the passenger seat of this truck, pointing at overpasses and asking me how they calculated the load. They will say I was a simple man. Let them. Simple men do not build empires. Patient men do. And you, Danny, are the most patient man I have ever known. She has one last trip in her. This is it. Love, Grandpa Walt." I did not leave the garage that night. I sat on the concrete floor with my back against the workbench and the letter in my hands, and I cried for the first time since I was a child. Not about the money, not about the land. About a man who drove 3 million miles and never once lost sight of what mattered. A man who watched his own son become someone he did not recognize and his grandson become everything he had hoped for. A man who hid an empire inside a dead truck because he knew that the only person who would ever try to bring it back to life was the only person he trusted with the truth. I called in sick on Monday, and Tuesday, and Wednesday. 3 days of sitting in my apartment, reading every page of the journal, tracing 42 years of purchases on a map I had pinned to my living room wall. 22 dots across 7 states. Each one a decision. Each one a bet placed by a man who understood something about patience that most people never learn. That the world rewards those who can see what is coming and wait for it to arrive. I started seeing a therapist that week. A woman named Dr. Navarro who specialized in family estrangement and grief. In our second session, I told her about the truck, the box, the documents. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Daniel, your grandfather did not just leave you money. He left you proof. Proof that being overlooked does not mean being less than. Proof that the quiet ones, the ones who watch and wait and build without applause, are sometimes the ones holding everything together." She paused. "He was describing himself. And he was describing you." That distinction broke something open in me. For 37 years, I had believed that my invisibility was a flaw. Something wrong with me. Something that made me less worthy of love than Craig's loudness or Amber's tears. Grandpa Walt's letter reframed it. My invisibility was not a weakness. It was a strategy. The same strategy he had used. Hide in plain sight. Build in silence. And when the time is right, let the work speak for itself. Russell Tate confirmed everything on Monday morning. He had been waiting for my call. "Your grandfather said you would find the box within 2 months. Took you 4 weeks. He underestimated you. He would have liked that." The trusts were clean, legal, and impenetrable. Russell had spent 3 decades building them under Walt's direction. Every property was held in a separate trust. Every trust was funded and documented. Every tax return was filed on time. The portfolio generated $1.6 million annually in rental income and mineral royalties, all of which had been reinvested into new acquisitions or deposited into trust accounts that I now controlled. "He also asked me to discuss the conservatorship file with you," Russell said. "The decision is yours. The evidence is sufficient for criminal fraud charges against your father and brother. Or you can hold it. Walt did not want to dictate your choice. He wanted you to have the power to make it." I told him I needed time. The family found out in late April. Craig had been trying to develop the Plainfield property and had hired a surveyor who discovered that an adjacent lot, one that would have been perfect for Craig's project, was owned by a trust called Mercer Land Holdings, LLC. Craig called the county clerk. The county clerk confirmed the trust was registered to a Russell Tate, attorney at law, in Joliet. Craig called Russell Tate. Russell Tate said nothing, which told Craig everything. Craig's phone call came at 11 at night. He was drunk. I could hear it in his voice. The bravado was louder than usual, which meant the fear underneath was worse. Daniel, what the hell is Mercer Land Holdings? A trust. Whose trust? Mine. What do you mean, yours? Since when do you have a land trust? Since Grandpa Walt died. Silence. I could hear him breathing. I could hear ice clinking in a glass. How much land are we talking about? That is not your concern, Craig. The hell it is not. He was my grandfather too. Whatever he had should be split equally. He was your grandfather, and in the last 3 years of his life you visited him twice. Both times to ask for money. You also filed a conservatorship petition trying to have him declared mentally incompetent so you could access his assets. Would you like to discuss that? The line went dead silent. Not the silence of thinking. The silence of a man who just realized that the ground beneath his feet was not as solid as he thought. That was Dad's idea, Craig said quietly. I just signed what he told me to sign. You signed a sworn affidavit claiming our grandfather was mentally incompetent. He scored in the 96th percentile on a cognitive assessment 2 weeks later. That is fraud, Craig. And I have the documentation. He hung up. My father called the next morning. His approach was different from Craig's. No shouting. No demands. The careful, measured voice of a man constructing a narrative in real time. Daniel, your mother and I would like to discuss your grandfather's estate. We believe there may be assets that were not included in the probate filing. There are no probate assets to discuss. The properties are held in trusts that predate the will by decades. They transfer automatically. They are not subject to probate, contestation, or redistribution. Daniel, be reasonable. Your grandfather was a truck driver. He did not have the sophistication to manage a complex trust structure. Someone must have influenced him. Someone did influence him. 42 years of watching his family take everything that was not nailed down. That influenced him to protect what he built. I am your father, and he was yours. That did not stop you from forging a conservatorship petition to take control of his finances. Did you think he would not find out? He was the most observant man I have ever known. He spent 42 years reading landscapes from behind a windshield. You think he could not read his own son? My father's voice changed. The careful construction collapsed. How much is it worth, Daniel? Enough for you to know that you will never see any of it. My mother called in tears the following day. She begged me to consider the family. She said Grandpa Walt would have wanted everyone to benefit. She said Craig was struggling and Amber was struggling and they were all struggling and family should support each other. I listened to her cry for a long time, and then I said, Mom, in the last 14 years, I have given this family $237,000. I paid for Craig's lawsuits, Amber's condo deposit, Dad's water heater, and everything else nobody wanted to pay for. Nobody ever set a place for me at the table. Nobody came to my apartment. Nobody called to ask how I was doing. And now the truck driver's grandson has something valuable, and suddenly everyone remembers I exist. She said, We always loved you, Daniel. I know, Mom. You loved me the way you love a savings account. You do not think about it until you need a withdrawal. She came to my apartment 2 days later, unannounced. She brought a casserole and a box of tissues and the careful, wounded expression of a woman who had rehearsed her pain in the mirror before leaving the house. I let her in because she was my mother and because the casserole smelled like home and because some habits take longer than 37 years to break. She sat at my kitchen table and cried for 15 minutes. Real tears, I think. Not the strategic kind Amber used. The kind that come from recognizing something you do not want to see. Your father is scared, she said. About the conservatorship documents. He should be. Daniel, please. He made a mistake. He tried to have his own father declared mentally incompetent so he could access his assets. Craig signed a false affidavit. That is not a mistake, Mom. That is fraud. And Grandpa knew about it. He documented everything. He had a forensic neuropsychological evaluation done to prove he was competent. 96th percentile. And then he changed his trusts to make sure none of you could touch what he had built. My mother stared at the casserole on the counter. She had not expected me to know the details. She had expected the old Daniel. The one who absorbed. The one who forgave. The one who wrote checks and asked nothing in return. That Daniel was sitting across from her, and he looked exactly the same, and he was gone. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "About the conservatorship?" "Nothing. For now." Grandpa did not want Dad in prison. He wanted him to know that I know. He wanted all of you to live with the understanding that the son you ignored has the power to hold you accountable and is choosing, for now, not to use it. She left the casserole. I ate it for 3 nights. It was good. Amber sent a text message. It was 4 paragraphs of guilt and tears and accusations. She said I was tearing the family apart. She said I was being selfish. She said Grandpa Walt would be ashamed. I read it twice and then typed a single response. Grandpa Walt left you $280,000. He left Craig a $1.9 million house. He left Mom the insurance and the personal effects. He left Dad a photograph. He left me a dead truck with flat tires. And you are calling me selfish because I am the only one who looked underneath. Craig's attorney sent a letter 2 weeks later, challenging the trusts on grounds of undue influence and cognitive decline. Russell Tate responded with a filing that included Walt's complete medical history, the neuropsychological assessment, 31 years of meticulously documented trust transactions, and a copy of the conservatorship petition that Craig and my father had filed and then withdrawn. The response also included a notice regarding an anti-contest provision in the master trust document. Any beneficiary of the probate estate who challenged the trust structure would forfeit their probate inheritance. Craig's attorney called Russell Tate the next day and withdrew the challenge. The Plainfield house, the investment accounts, all of it would have been at risk. In the months that followed, I worked with Russell to transition the portfolio. I visited every property, all 22 of them. I drove Grandpa Walt's routes, retracing the highways he had traveled for 4 decades, stopping at the parcels he had bought along the way. In Nebraska, I stood on the 40 acres he had shown me when I was 16. It was no longer empty farmland. The interchange he had predicted was built in 2008. A distribution center sat on the adjacent lot. The 40 acres were now worth $1.2 million. In Oklahoma, I met the energy company representative who managed the mineral leases. He said, "Your grandfather negotiated the best landowner terms I have ever seen. He understood what was under the ground better than most geologists. He said he could feel it in the vibration of the road." In Colorado, I stood on 160 acres of ranch land with the Rocky Mountains on the horizon and thought about a man who saw this view from behind a windshield and thought, "That is worth stopping for." He had bought it for $12,000. It was now appraised at $3.8 million. I drove home on Interstate 80, the same road Grandpa Walt had driven thousands of times. I had rented a truck for the trip. Not a Ford, but close enough. The road stretched out ahead of me, flat and straight and endless, and I understood what he had been trying to tell me my entire life. The value is underneath. Underneath the surface, underneath the assumptions, underneath the image people project and the stories they tell about themselves. My father saw a truck driver. I saw an empire builder. My family saw a rusty pickup. I saw a vault. They saw a broken-down old man. I saw the smartest person I have ever known. The old Ford is in my garage now. I finished the restoration. New engine, new paint, new interior, but the same frame. The same bones. I left the steel box on the frame. I welded it shut again after removing the documents, and now it sits there empty and sealed, a monument to the man who built it. When I start the engine, it catches on the first try. The sound fills the garage, deep and steady, the sound of something built to last. I drive it on Saturdays, not far, through the countryside south of the city, past cornfields and interchanges and small towns that are growing the way Grandpa Walt predicted they would. I drive slowly, one hand on the wheel, and I look at the land the way he taught me to look at it. Not for what it is, for what it will become. Sometimes I pass a lot with a for sale sign, and I pull over and write down the number. Old habits. His habits. The ones he gave me on Saturday afternoons in the passenger seat of this truck. Back when I was 9 years old and the world was something you could understand if you just paid attention. My family still has what Grandpa Walt gave them. The house, the accounts, the insurance. They have more than most people will ever have. And it is not enough because somewhere south of the city, on a road he drove 10,000 times, his grandson is behind the wheel of a truck they call junk, sitting on $31 million they will never touch, driving slowly, watching the land, and remembering every word he ever said. Thank you for walking this journey with me. Before you go, I have left 2 more stories here on your screen. Both from men who discovered that family is not always who you are born to. It is who stands by you when the truth comes out. Click on whichever one calls to you. And if you want to join our community of people who understand what it is like to be the outsider looking in, that notification bell is your invitation. Until tomorrow, remember, your story matters, even if they tried to erase it.